The morning tea in the palace felt different that Tuesday. Princess Victoria sat across from her grandmother, the Queen, fidgeting with her pearl bracelet. The Queen noticed her granddaughter's nervous energy but continued reading the daily reports as usual. Outside the tall windows, gardeners trimmed the rose bushes while morning sunlight painted everything golden. Victoria took a deep breath and set down her teacup. Grandmother, I need to tell you something important. The Queen looked up from her papers. At 78, she had heard many announcements from family members. Most were predictable. This felt different. I'm getting married, Victoria said quietly. A smile crossed the Queen's face. Wonderful, dear. Which young man has finally won your heart? Is it the Duke's son from Belgium? Or perhaps that charming banker from Switzerland? Victoria shook her head slowly. His name is David. He's a social worker here in the city. The Queen's teacup paused halfway to her lips. She set it down carefully, the delicate china making barely a sound against the saucer. A social worker. Yes, he helps children who don't have homes. He runs programs for teenagers who are struggling. He's the most caring person I've ever met. The silence stretched between them, through the windows. They could hear the distant sound of traffic from the city beyond the palace gates. The Queen had ruled for 52 years. She had seen her country change, had adapted to new times while preserving old traditions. But this announcement caught her completely off guard. Tell me about his family, the Queen said finally. Victoria's voice grew softer. His parents came here from another country when he was young. They were running from danger in their homeland. His father works in a factory now. His mother cleans offices at night. They live in a small apartment near the market district. The Queen stood and walked to the window. Below, she could see the palace guards changing shifts. Everything followed precise timing. Exact protocol. Her world ran on centuries of tradition and careful order. Victoria, you understand what this means. The newspapers will have opinions. Parliament will have concerns. The people will talk. I know, grandmother. But I love him. Those four simple words hung in the air. The Queen remembered being young, remembered her own arranged marriage that had grown into deep love over time. But that was different. That was expected. This was uncharted territory. That evening, David arrived for dinner. He had borrowed a suit from his roommate, a teacher who was roughly the same size. The jacket was slightly too big, and he kept tugging at the sleeves. He had never been inside a palace before. The marble floors reflected his nervous footsteps as a butler led him through corridors, lined with portraits of kings and queens from centuries past. Victoria met him at the entrance to the dining room. She looked beautiful in a simple blue dress, but David could see the worry in her eyes. Just be yourself, she whispered, squeezing his hand. The dining room could seat 50 people, but tonight only 6 were present. The Queen sat at the head of the long table. Victoria's parents, the Prince and Princess, sat on one side. Victoria and David sat on the other. The 6th chair belonged to the Queen's private secretary, an elderly man who had served the royal family for 40 years. David had practiced with the silverware. Victoria had taught him which fork to use first, how to hold his napkin, when to speak and when to listen. But sitting there under the crystal chandelier, surrounded by oil paintings of royal ancestors, all that practice felt useless. So, David, the prince said, cutting into his roast beef, Victoria tells us you work with young people. Yes, sir. I run an after-school program for kids who don't have safe places to go. We help them with homework, give them dinner, sometimes just listen when they need to talk. That sounds, the princess paused, searching for the right word, challenging. David's face lit up. It is, but it's also amazing. Last month, one of our kids got accepted to university. First person in his family to even finish high school. Another girl we've been working with just got her first job. She was living on the streets 6 months ago. The Queen watched David's expression as he spoke about his work. His nervousness disappeared when he talked about the children. His hands moved as he described teaching a boy to read, helping a girl learn to cook, organizing basketball games in the community center. And your family, the Queen asked, what do they think about your Relationship with Victoria. David smiled. My mother cried when I told her. Happy tears, though. She said she always knew Victoria was special when she saw her on television, visiting the children's hospital. My father just asked if Victoria makes me happy when I said yes. He said that's all that matters. The simplicity of that response surprised everyone at the table. In their world, marriages involve political considerations, economic advantages, international relations. The idea that happiness could be the primary factor seemed almost foreign. After dinner, the Queen walked to her private study. Through her window, she could see David's old car parked among the sleek vehicles of the palace staff. It was a small, dented sedan that had seen better days. But as she watched, David stopped to help an elderly gardener who had dropped his tools. Without being asked, without thinking about his borrowed suit, David picked up the scattered rakes and shovels. The gardener, surprised by the help, smiled and shook David's hand. They talked for a few minutes before David continued to his car. The Queen watched this simple interaction with growing curiosity. Who was this young man who could make her granddaughter glow with happiness? Who spoke about homeless children with such passion? Who helped elderly gardeners without expectation of recognition? As David's car disappeared through the palace gates, the Queen realized she had more questions than answers. But for the first time since Victoria's announcement, those questions came from genuine interest rather than royal concern. The next morning's newspapers would be full of speculation. The palace phone would ring with calls from advisors and politicians. But tonight, the Queen sat in her study, thinking about a young man who had borrowed a suit to have dinner with a princess, and wondering what kind of person he really was beneath the nervousness. In unfamiliar surroundings. Change, she reflected, had always been part of royal life. Perhaps it was time to learn about a different kind of change altogether. The Queen's morning routine had changed since Victoria's announcement. Instead of reading only the political reports, she now found herself reviewing a thick folder that her private secretary had prepared. David's life was laid out in careful detail across dozens of pages. Born in a refugee camp 28 years ago, parents fled their homeland during civil unrest, arrived here when David was 3 years old. Father worked 3 jobs to support the family. Mother learned English by watching children's television programs. David earned a scholarship to university, studied social work, graduated with honors. The facts painted a picture of struggle and determination, but they felt cold on paper. The Queen set the folder aside and walked to her window. She wanted to understand the man, not just his history. 3 weeks later, the opportunity came during the annual state dinner for visiting dignitaries. David attended as Victoria's guest, looking more comfortable in his properly fitted tuxedo. The Queen watched him from across the grand ballroom, noting how he listened carefully when others spoke, how he asked thoughtful questions about the guest home countries. Then she noticed something that made her pause. A young server, probably no older than 18, was struggling with a heavy tray of crystal glasses. The boy's hand shook slightly as he navigated between the formally dressed guests. The Queen watched several people notice his difficulty, but they simply stepped aside to avoid any potential accident. David was different. Without hesitation, he approached the young server with a gentle smile. Heavy load tonight, he said quietly, taking one side of the tray. Together, they carried it safely to the serving station. Thank you, sir, the boy whispered, relief clear in his voice. I was so nervous about dropping something. Been there myself. David replied with a wink. Your first big event? The boy nodded. You're doing great. Just remember, everyone here puts their pants on one leg at a time, just like you do. The simple comment made the boy laugh softly, and his shoulders relaxed. David patted his arm encouragingly before returning to Victoria's side. The entire interaction lasted less than 2 minutes, but the Queen had observed every second. Later that evening, she asked her secretary about the young server. New hire, Your Majesty. Started last week. Very nervous about working these formal events. The Queen nodded thoughtfully. David hadn't helped the boy for recognition or praise. He had done it because someone needed help, And he was the kind of person who noticed when others struggled. The next test came unexpectedly. Victoria had invited David to accompany her to the opening of a new children's wing at the city hospital. These events were usually formal affairs with ribbon cutting, speeches, and carefully arranged photo opportunities. The Queen decided to observe from a distance. She arrived early and positioned herself where she could watch without being noticed. Victoria and David toured the facility with the hospital director, viewing the bright, cheerful rooms designed to make sick children feel more comfortable. In the pediatric ward, they met a group of young patients who were well enough to participate in the ceremony. Most were excited to meet a real princess, asking Victoria about her castle and whether she had a crown. Victoria answered their questions with warmth and patience, clearly comfortable with children. But it was David who surprised everyone when a shy 7-year-old boy refused to come forward with the other children. David knelt down beside his wheelchair. Not feeling very social today, David asked gently. The boy shook his head, clutching a worn stuffed elephant. "I like your elephant. What's his name?" "Peanut," the boy whispered. "Peanut looks like he's been on some adventures." For the next 10 minutes, David sat on the floor beside the wheelchair, listening as the boy told stories about Peanut's imaginary travels. Victoria continued with the official tour, but she kept glancing back at David with obvious affection. The Queen watched as other children gradually joined David and the quiet boy. Soon he was surrounded by a small group, all sharing stories about their favorite toys and games. The formal ribbon cutting could wait. Something more important was happening on the hospital floor. When it was time to leave, the shy boy tugged on David's sleeve. "Will you come back to visit Peanut and me? If your doctors say it's okay, I'd love to," David replied seriously. "Maybe Peanut can tell me about some new adventures." The drive back to the palace was quiet. Victoria held David's hand as their car moved through the city streets. "You were wonderful with those children," she said softly. "They were easy to talk to. Kids usually are, once they trust you." That evening, the Queen received an unexpected phone call from the hospital director. "Your Majesty, I wanted to thank you for bringing such special guests today. The young man who came with Princess Victoria has offered to volunteer in our pediatric ward. He asked if he could read stories to the children once a week." The Queen hung up the phone and sat in her favorite chair, thinking. David hadn't volunteered for publicity or to impress anyone. He had connected with those children genuinely, and now he wanted to continue that connection. Over the following months, the Queen arranged for David to accompany Victoria to various royal duties. She told herself it was to prepare him for royal life, but truthfully, she was studying him. At a memorial service for veterans, David spent time listening to elderly soldiers share stories about their service. He remembered their names, asked about their families, and genuinely cared about their experiences. During a visit to a community center in a struggling neighborhood, David noticed that the building's heating system wasn't working properly. While Victoria gave her prepared remarks, David quietly spoke with the facility manager about repair costs and potential funding sources. Each time, the Queen observed the same pattern. David's instinct wasn't to perform compassion for cameras, but to notice when people needed help and to offer what assistance he could. Palace staff began sharing stories with the Queen. David always thanked the kitchen workers after meals. He learned the names of the security guards and asked about their families. When it rained, he offered his umbrella to others without thinking twice. He's different from the usual visitors. Her secretary mentioned one morning, the staff actually looked forward to his visits. The Queen was beginning to understand why Victoria had chosen this unusual young man. In a world where royal duties often felt scripted and formal, David brought something rare and precious, authentic human kindness. That wasn't performed for others, but simply part of who he was. The wedding was only 3 months away when disaster struck the city. It started as a small electrical fire in an old apartment building near the Palace District, but strong winds spread the flames to neighboring structures. By morning, 42 families had lost their homes, and the local community was in chaos. The Queen watched the news coverage from her private sitting room. already planning the royal family's response. There would be an official statement expressing sympathy, a formal visit to assess the damage, perhaps a charitable donation from the Royal Foundation. These were the proper procedures, followed for decades during times of crisis. Victoria knocked on her door around noon. "Grandmother, have you seen David this morning?" "No, dear. Isn't he supposed to be at the wedding rehearsal with the palace coordinator?" Victoria looked worried. "He never showed up. His phone goes straight to voicemail. This isn't like him at all." The Queen felt a flutter of concern. Perhaps the pressure of royal life was finally getting to the young man. Maybe he had decided this world was too much for him. It wouldn't be the first time someone had run away from royal responsibilities. "Have you checked his apartment?" the Queen asked. "I sent security there an hour ago. His neighbor said he left very early this morning with a backpack and some boxes." The Queen's secretary appeared in the doorway. "Your Majesty, the car is ready for your visit to the fire site." As they drove through the city, Victoria stared out the window anxiously. The Queen patted her granddaughter's hand reassuringly, though she had her own growing concerns about David's disappearance. They arrived at the temporary shelter set up in the community center. Local officials greeted them with the usual ceremony, explaining the extent of the damage and the number of people affected. The Queen listened politely, preparing for her walkthrough of the facility. But as they entered the main hall, she stopped short. There, in the far corner, sat a familiar figure on the floor with a group of children gathered around him. David was pulling colorful scarves from his sleeve while the kids giggled with delight. "And now," David announced dramatically, "I need a volunteer to help me find my missing rabbit." A little girl with pigtails raised her hand eagerly. David handed her a magic wand made from a pencil with a paper star taped to the end. "Wave this 3 times and say the magic words." "What are the magic words?" she asked seriously. "Please. And thank you, of course. The most powerful magic in the world." The children erupted in laughter as David pretended to pull a stuffed rabbit from behind the girl's ear. The Queen watched from the entrance, temporarily forgotten by the local officials, who were equally transfixed by the impromptu magic show. Victoria rushed toward David, relief flooding her face. "There you are. I was so worried." David looked up, surprised to see the royal entourage. "Oh, I'm sorry. I should have called." He stood up, still holding the stuffed rabbit. "I saw the news this morning and I had to come help. But the wedding rehearsal. I know, and I'm sorry. But these families lost everything last night." The children were scared and confused. The adults are dealing with insurance and housing issues. "I thought maybe I could just keep the kids occupied while their parents figure things out." The Queen approached the group slowly. The children looked up at her with wide eyes, recognizing her from television and picture books, but instead of the usual nervous excitement she encountered during official visits, these children seemed calm and happy. "Your Majesty," David said, suddenly remembering royal protocol. He started to bow, still holding the magic rabbit. "Please, continue with your show," the Queen said gently. "I'd like to watch." For the next 20 minutes, David entertained not just the children, but their parents too. His magic tricks were simple, clearly practiced from his work with homeless youth. But his ability to make people smile in the midst of their worst day was remarkable. The Queen noticed other things too. David had organized volunteers to sort donated clothing by size. He had helped set up a system for families to find each other in the crowded shelter. Someone had written a list of needed supplies on a whiteboard, and David's handwriting was all over it. A tired-looking woman approached the Queen during David's grand finale. "Excuse me, Your Majesty, I just wanted to say thank you for bringing that young man here." "Oh, I didn't bring him. He came on his own." The woman looked surprised. "Really? He's been here since 6 this morning. Helped my family find blankets, made breakfast for the kids, even found my husband's diabetes medication when we thought it was lost in the fire." She paused, watching David take a bow as the children applauded. "My daughter hasn't spoken since last night, too scared, but she's been laughing for the past hour." The Queen looked across the room and saw the little girl with pigtails whispering something to David. He knelt down to listen, nodding seriously as she spoke. Then he handed her the stuffed rabbit. "Peanut here is very brave," he told her. "He'll keep you safe tonight." The child hugged the rabbit tightly and managed a small smile. Later, as the royal visit concluded, the Queen pulled David aside. "You missed an important rehearsal today, I know, and I'm truly sorry. I just couldn't sit in a palace planning a party when people were hurting so close by." The Queen studied his face. "You understand that being part of this family means following certain protocols, attending scheduled events." "Yes, ma'am, and I promise I'll do better. But I hope you also understand that I can't just pretend people aren't suffering when I have the ability to help." That evening, the Queen sat in her study reviewing the day's events. The official visit had gone well. The media coverage would be positive. But her thoughts kept returning to David's magic show and the woman's gratitude for his presence. Her secretary brought the evening reports. "Interesting note, Your Majesty. The young man, David, has apparently been volunteering at emergency shelters for years. The staff at today's location knew him immediately." The Queen wasn't surprised. David hadn't helped those families to impress anyone or gain recognition. He had helped because that's who he was, a person who noticed when others needed support and couldn't ignore their pain. For the first time since Victoria's engagement announcement, the Queen began to see David not as an outsider trying to fit into their world, but as someone who might help their world remember what it meant to truly serve others. 2 weeks after the fire incident, the Queen made an unusual request. She asked David to join her for afternoon tea, just the two of them. No Victoria, no palace staff, no formal agenda. David arrived at the appointed time, clearly nervous, but trying his best to appear calm. The Queen's private sitting room was much smaller than the grand reception halls David had grown accustomed to. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, and the furniture felt comfortable rather than imposing. Still, David perched on the edge of his chair like he might need to run at any moment. "Relax," the Queen said, pouring tea from a simple ceramic pot. "I'm not going to interrogate you." David managed a small smile. "I wasn't sure what to expect." "Your Majesty, I wanted to talk about the wedding arrangements, but first, tell me about your work. Really tell me, not the polite version you give at formal dinners." David's posture changed immediately. When he spoke about his job, his nervousness disappeared. Most people see homeless kids and think they're lost cousins, but they're not. They're just children who've had terrible things happen to them. What kind of terrible things? Some have been hurt by the people who were supposed to protect them. Others aged out of foster care with nowhere to go. A few are running from dangerous situations at home. David's voice grew stronger. Society looks at a 16-year-old sleeping in a doorway and sees a problem to be solved or ignored. I see a kid who needs someone to believe in them. The Queen listened carefully. "And Victoria, how did you meet her?" David's face lit up. "She was volunteering at a literacy program downtown. I brought some of my kids there for tutoring help. She was reading to a group of younger children, using different voices for all the characters. The kids were completely captivated." That doesn't sound like Victoria. Maybe not the Victoria you see at state functions, but it's definitely the Victoria I fell in love with. David leaned forward slightly. "She has this way of making every person feel important, not because they're wealthy or connected, but just because they're human." The Queen raised an eyebrow. "Go on." "There was this one boy, maybe 8 years old, who couldn't read very well. The other kids sometimes made fun of him. But Victoria spent extra time with him after each session. She never made him feel stupid or slow. She just patiently worked with him until he started to believe he could learn." David paused, lost in the memory. One day, he read an entire book by himself, a simple book. But still, when he finished, he looked up at Victoria with the biggest smile and said, "I did it." Victoria started crying right there in front of everyone. Victoria cried, happy tears. She was so proud of him. Later, I asked her why it meant so much to her. She said that moment, seeing that boy realize he wasn't stupid, was better than any royal ceremony she'd ever attended. The Queen set down her teacup. This was a side of Victoria she rarely saw. Her granddaughter had always been dutiful, following royal protocols perfectly. But David was describing someone passionate and deeply caring. Your Majesty, David continued, Victoria could have chosen anyone. Dukes, businessmen, celebrities, people with money and titles and influence. She chose me because she sees something worth loving in broken people. That's who she really is. The Queen was quiet for a long moment. And what do you see in her? I see someone who cares more about people than appearances. Someone who reads bedtime stories to sick children with the same enthusiasm she brings to state speeches. Someone who remembers the names of janitors and kitchen staff and asks about their families. David's voice grew softer. I see someone who could have lived her entire life in comfort and privilege, never thinking about people like me or the kids I work with, but instead, she chooses to spend her free time helping others learn to read, not for publicity or photo opportunities, but because she genuinely believes every person deserves a chance to succeed. The Queen realized she was learning about her granddaughter through David's eyes. You make her sound almost like a stranger to me. Maybe that's because she's been trying so hard to be the perfect princess that she forgot you might love her just as much for being perfectly human. That evening, the Queen found herself watching Victoria differently during their family dinner. When Victoria mentioned visiting the children's hospital the next day, the Queen noticed the genuine excitement in her voice. When Victoria asked about the kitchen staff member who had been sick, the Queen realized her granddaughter knew personal details about dozens of palace employees. After dinner, the Queen walked with Victoria in the palace gardens. Tell me about your literacy work, she said. Victoria looked surprised. You want to know about that. David mentioned it. He seems to think it's important to you. Victoria's face transformed. For the next 30 minutes, she talked about the children she worked with, the progress they made, the challenges they faced. She spoke with passion and knowledge, describing reading techniques and learning difficulties with the same precision she brought to royal duties. There's a girl named Lucy who couldn't recognize letters when we started yesterday. She read her first complete sentence. David was there, and we both got emotional watching her face when she realized what she'd accomplished. The Queen saw it then, the connection between Victoria and David that went beyond romance. They shared something deeper than attraction or compatibility. They both saw potential in people others had written off. They both believed in second chances and the power of kindness. Grandmother Victoria said quietly, I know David isn't what you expected for me, but he makes me want to be better. Not a better princess, but a better person. They walked in comfortable silence past the rose garden where Victoria had played as a child. The Queen remembered those days when Victoria's biggest concerns were scraped knees and bedtime stories. Now she was a woman who had found someone who appreciated her heart as much as her title. He loves you, the Queen said finally. Yes, he does. And you love him. Victoria smiled. More than I ever thought possible. The Queen looked at her granddaughter, really looked at her, and saw not just the princess she had trained, but the woman she had become. A woman who chose love based on character rather than convenience, who found joy in helping others learn to read, who cried when children succeeded against the odds. For the first time since the engagement announcement, the Queen began to understand that perhaps Victoria hadn't chosen poorly at all. Perhaps she had chosen exactly the right person to help her become the kind of leader their country truly needed. The wedding day arrived with unprecedented media attention. News crews lined the streets leading to the cathedral, and thousands of people gathered to catch a glimpse of the princess and her unusual groom. The newspapers had been divided for months. Traditional supporters worried about the future of the monarchy, while younger generations celebrated Victoria's choice to follow her heart. Inside the palace, controlled chaos reigned. Wedding coordinators rushed through hallways with last-minute adjustments. Flowers were being arranged in the cathedral. The kitchen staff prepared for the reception that would host 300 guests from around the world. The Queen stood in her dressing room, watching her lady-in-waiting fasten a diamond brooch that had belonged to her own grandmother. Through her window, she could see crowds of people already gathering despite the early hour. Some held signs supporting Victoria and David. Others looked skeptical about this break from tradition. "Nervous day, Your Majesty?" her secretary asked, reviewing the final schedule. "Every wedding day brings uncertainty," the Queen replied diplomatically. But truthfully, she felt more curious than nervous after months of observing David. She had developed a grudging respect for the young man. Today would be the ultimate test of whether he could handle the pressure of royal life permanently. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Victoria looked radiant in her grandmother's wedding gown, modified slightly to fit her perfectly. David stood at the altar looking proud and slightly overwhelmed, but no longer the nervous young man who had first entered the palace months ago. As the couple exchanged vows they had written themselves, the Queen found herself genuinely moved. Victoria promised to support David's work with children, and to always remember that love meant serving others together. David promised to honor Victoria's royal duties, while helping her stay connected to the people their family served. The cathedral erupted in cheers as they were pronounced husband and wife. Outside, church bells rang across the city, and the crowd celebrated with enthusiasm that surprised even the most optimistic palace officials. The reception was held in the palace's grand ballroom, decorated with thousands of white roses and crystal chandeliers that sparkled like stars. Foreign dignitaries mingled with local officials, while family members from both sides tried to navigate the complex social dynamics of royal protocol. The Queen circulated among the guests, accepting congratulations and making polite conversation. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned, until she noticed smoke coming from the direction of the kitchen. Within minutes, palace security had the situation under control. A small fire in one of the industrial ovens had been quickly extinguished, and no one was hurt. The guests continued celebrating, most unaware that anything had happened. But the Queen noticed the catering staff looking distressed. These were temporary workers hired specifically for the wedding, and she could see the worry in their faces. The head chef, a woman in her 50s who had worked for the palace for many events, looked particularly upset. David noticed too. While other guests continued dancing and chatting, he made his way toward the kitchen area. The Queen followed at a distance, curious to see what he would do. "Is everyone okay?" David asked the chef quietly. "Yes, sir. Thank you. Just worried about our jobs. The agency might not hire us again if they think we're careless with equipment." David listened as she explained that the oven had malfunctioned, something completely beyond their control. But the catering company had strict policies about incidents during high-profile events. Several of the staff members were single parents who couldn't afford to lose this income. "Don't worry about that," David said firmly. "Let me talk to someone." The Queen watched as David found Victoria across the ballroom. He whispered something in her ear, and her expression immediately grew concerned. Together, they approached the catering manager. "We understand there was a small incident in the kitchen," Victoria said gracefully. "We want to make sure everyone knows how grateful we are for your quick response and professionalism. Your Highness, I assure you we'll investigate how this happened and take appropriate action," the manager replied nervously. David stepped forward. "Actually, we'd like to ensure that no one faces any negative consequences. Equipment malfunctions happen. What matters is that your team handled it perfectly and kept everyone safe." Victoria nodded. "In fact, we'd like to personally thank each member of your staff for their excellent work tonight." For the next 20 minutes, the newlyweds moved through the kitchen area, shaking hands with dishwashers, servers, and cooks. They learned names, asked about families, and made sure everyone understood that their jobs were secure. The Queen observed this entire interaction from the ballroom doorway. No cameras captured these moments. No reporters wrote about the couple's concern for temporary workers. This wasn't performed for public relations or media coverage. Later, as the evening wound down, an elderly guest approached the Queen. Lord Wellington, a family friend for decades, had been skeptical about the marriage from the beginning. "I must admit, Your Majesty, I had concerns about this union. Seemed rather unconventional for our traditions." "And now?" the Queen asked. "I watched something interesting tonight." When that kitchen incident happened, most of us barely noticed. But your granddaughter and her new husband immediately thought about how it might affect the working people involved. He paused, sipping his champagne. Rather unusual for royalty to concern themselves with the employment troubles of temporary staff, wouldn't you say? The Queen smiled slightly. What did you think of their response? Honestly, it reminded me why we have a monarchy in the first place. To serve the people, all the people, not just the prominent ones. As the last guest departed, the Queen found Victoria and David on the ballroom balcony, still in their wedding attire, but looking relaxed for the first time all day. How does it feel to be married? The Queen asked. Victoria leaned against David's shoulder. Perfect, even with the kitchen drama. That wasn't drama, David said gently. That was just making sure good people didn't get punished for something. That wasn't their fault. Rather unusual concern for staff members, the Queen observed. Echoing Lord Wellington's comment. Victoria looked up at her grandmother. That's the human I married. Those 6 simple words crystallized everything the Queen had been learning about this couple. Over the past months, Victoria hadn't chosen David despite his common background or lack of royal connections. She had chosen him because his humanity brought out her own. In a world where royal duties often became performance, where charity work was scheduled and photographed, where interactions with regular people were carefully managed and brief, David represented something precious and rare. He reminded Victoria that their real job wasn't to be perfect symbols, but to be genuinely helpful human beings. The Queen looked at the young couple, no longer seeing a princess who had married beneath her station, but to people who would make each other better while serving their country with authentic care and compassion. Welcome to the family, David, she said warmly. As she walked back through the empty ballroom. Past the scattered rose petals and flickering candles, the Queen realized that perhaps the monarchy's future was in exactly the right hands after all.